Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 26th installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation Webinar Series. I'll be your host today. My name is Dwayne Mancini. I'm the CEO and Managing Partner at Project MedTech. Today we'll be hearing from David Halleck at HWI for a discussion on connected everything and the miniaturization of hardware. But first, a few housekeeping slides and some information on Galen Data. The Galen Data is the cloud for medical device makers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant to FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. Built on 40+ years of collective experience developing compliant systems in the medical device industry, the company's goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of the cost while shaving months off the development timeline. Now I'd like to introduce our guest, David Halleck. David, welcome to the Galen Data webinar series.
Well, thank you, Dwayne. It's good to be here, and I'm excited to be able to talk a little bit about what I've been up to for the last 26 years. So I appreciate the invite.
Yeah, I love that. So, David, if you wouldn't mind, maybe just an intro into, like you said, who you are, what you've been doing, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, no, appreciate it. So yeah, Dwayne, my name is David Halleck. I am VP of Electrical Engineering here at HWI, which is part of the development arm of Steripac. Now I'll get a little bit more into that. But even first, before I want to jump into that, just looking at the name Connected Everything and the miniaturization of hardware. So the first thing that pops up into my mind when I talk about the miniaturization of hardware is the classic, I think it's a classic at least, the Zoolander 2001 film with Ben Stiller, and really showing the flip phone ride in 2001, and okay, what does it mean to make something miniature? And they're obviously making fun of it, but it really strikes a chord with really it's a trap that people fall into with miniaturization, and they think, well, okay, just to make something the same and miniaturize it. At the time, if you recall, it was the flip phone, right? It was the Motorola, what was it? The flip phone that everybody was trying to emulate. And so what happened is, and it's just a joke here, but what happens is you fall into this trap where you're trying to shrink everything and make the current requirements really fall in line with kind of what's going on, instead of looking ahead and looking forward looking. And so what I would propose, and what I'll talk a little bit about going forward, is really understanding, okay, what are we trying to do? What are the human factors involved? And what are some of the traps that we fall into as we're designing something that maybe the user or the patient isn't really looking for? And then the connectivity piece of it is really driving. I want to bring up one story here really quick. When I was in Kenya, I was doing a missions trip in Kenya back in 2018, and it was really interesting. It was a great trip. I would encourage anybody to get out, get outside of their comfort level, get into different cultures, different areas of the world. But one of the things that I found was just fascinating was that within Kenya, and it's the slums of Kenya, we're putting up a school and a church to be able to help these the folks in the area. But really, you think about needs of people, and the first thing that comes up is food, right? Everybody needs food. Everybody needs water. Everybody needs shelter. And the fourth one really was a surprise to me, is everybody has connected cell phones. It's just amazing how integrated it's been, incorporated into, obviously, not only the US, but into the entire world. So getting back into the name of the series here, Connected Everything and the Miniaturization of Hardware. I mean, it's happening everywhere. And so so that it really, like I said, resonates with me and my experience. And just to get a little bit further into that, my experience, I started out with Ball Aerospace. I'm an RF engineer by trade. This is back in the mid 90s, and so dating me a little bit. But what happens is that experience and really building on the experience is what makes me today, and what makes the what puts the value in with anybody, right? Their experience is really what drives them. so Ball Aerospace, that was great to really hone in my RF and engineering skills. Uh, I went then later to 3 acquisitions. It was Peak Industries, that was then later acquired by Delphi, then was later acquired by Spartan. So that was what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? But really, that honed in my medical and my contract manufacturing skills that I didn't necessarily have earlier. I then went to Plexus, which was kind of taking that model and putting it onto steroids. And so really driving that, taking those contract development, contract manufacturing in the medical arena and taking that to the next level. And then after that, I had the privilege to work on the other side of the fence with an OEM in Bard Medical. And so they were then acquired by BD, because it seems like everybody's either being acquired by BD or Medtronic. It seems like the pendulum always goes one way or the other. It seems like M&A is happening all over the place right now. But yeah, that really drove my experience. And then being at HWI for about the last 5 years, driving, really working and building a smaller business. And so HWI started back in 1984 with my father. And my brother is here as well, and been president of HWI for the last 25, 26 years. But then really driving and building HWI within the last 5 years really enabled me to hone in all that hardware experience, that technology. And again, what makes me what I am today. So with that said, so just last year, HWI, just to give you a little bit of background, was acquired by Sterapak. So Sterapak is a contract manufacturing company in Florida, Poland, Malaysia, obviously in Frederick, Colorado, now here with HWI, but in New Jersey, Morristown, New Jersey, with another company, HSD, that was acquired. And I've known Tor Alden for a number of years. It really made sense to bring everything internal as far as a full value stream. And this is kind of the model that the Plexuses of the world have. But really, Sterapak driving medical devices, diagnostics, pharmaceuticals, and combination devices, really bringing that forward together, and then including more of the technology. So what HWI does, what HSD, what Frederick or Morristown does, really helps complete that kind of picture. So yeah, so that's a little bit about myself, a little bit about Sterapak, and where we're at today.
Yeah. So you brought up the razor and the miniaturization of from Zoolander. It makes me laugh because I think when we look at conversations like this, it doesn't matter where you're at, you end up feeling old, right? Like when you showed that, I'm only 32, and I was wearing my earbuds yesterday, like my AirPods, and I'm thinking to myself, when I was a kid, we used to jokingly walk around and go like this, right, and act like you're talking into like a really small miniature piece, but like you couldn't have that, like that was crazy. And now everybody walks around with wireless headphones in their ears that are super small, right? So it's just like I'm just like, oh boy, I am getting old. So now I'm going through this battle of like, am I old or am I not? So,
Well, you go through those phases of technology, right? But
right.
but having that experience enables you to really see where the next technology is going to go too, right? So
Right.
everything is shrinking. I mean, interestingly enough, that was before the iPhone went
Mm-hmm.
out. I mean, the iPhone kind of came out in 2007, 2006, or something like that. But it obviously got a lot bigger, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
what didn't get, and it didn't get bigger. The technology didn't get bigger. What they did was they combined the laptop, the personal computer. Now it's into this tiny little device. And exactly to your point, Dwayne, now the communication is to this earbud, right?
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily going straight to the cell phone tower, right? It's using Bluetooth and some of the newer technologies, and we'll get a little bit into that as well.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about how has connected medical devices changed, and also the second part of that is, where's it going? Because we've seen quite a bit of evolution in this space. I mean, really quickly in the last few years, let alone the last 5 to 10. So I'm curious on your perspective.
Yeah, so the technology and we want to be on the bleeding edge, and typically medical isn't on the bleeding edge; it's a lagger. And so what we want to do is be able to take that technology and bring it into um, smaller devices, body-worn devices. We talked about the one of the things that I've seen recently. It's been a lot of razor blade type models, if that makes sense, right? Where you have a consumable, you have an infusion pump, right, as the capital equipment. That's your razor. The consumable is the set itself, and so you lose a little bit of margin on the capital equipment, but then you make a bajillion of the sets, and so that's where a lot of the revenue and money is made. And that really hasn't changed, but what I'm seeing, and this is with Galen, obviously you guys are seeing this effect as well, is it's not just the razor blade model anymore, it's the app. It's razor blade app. Everything is talking to the cloud, right, or your cell phone or whatever. So there has to be connectivity, and it's ever shrinking connectivity, obviously, as devices get smaller and smaller. Some of the avenues that's gone down is you can really think of it in three different layers as far as wireless communication. And so you have your PANs, which are your personal area networks, and that's what's your phone with the Bluetooth, the near field communications. A lot of like RFID isn't a new technology, obviously, but it's just getting more and more sophisticated. And so you have different levels of RFID and these near field and PAN technologies really driving this personal area network. And that's just going to get smaller and smaller and require higher and higher speeds.
Yeah, so real quick, not to interrupt, but just
Yeah.
for the sake of explaining everything. So you explained what PAN meant. What about RFID?
Yeah, so RFID is basically it's a passive type communication system. It can actually be an active type communication system as well. And so basically, what you do is you have a certain frequency. You basically radiate it into another chip. It uses that as a passive, as its energy source, and then you can communicate. Low data rates. I mean, typically it's not a lot of bandwidth or a lot of data. But if you just need to communicate a certain parameter or a flag or something, it can be a super cheap, really small type communication device that can be used for especially with wearable technologies, and then passing on sensor technologies as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
And then also, and so then you get your personal area network, and then the LAN, and that's kind of older technologies with your local area network. I mean, everybody's used to Ethernet. Wi-Fi is obviously a big one, but it has a lot of overhead as well, so it takes a lot of power. It takes a lot of power to communicate a lot of data, right? And we're now in this phase where we're just have data bombardment, right? I mean, everybody's collecting data, everybody's trying to mine data. Not so many people are doing it well, but that's where it's the app, the razor blade app slash database comes into play. But there's new technologies in the local area network as well. Zigbee they started out strong a number of years ago. That's a at-home wireless type system. I hear they're actually getting legs again. So we might see some rumblings. It's a little lower power requirement, excuse me, for that technologies. There's technologies like DECT that the school systems uses. So you'll see some of these merging technologies, and Wi-Fi is obviously changing their technology as time goes. Bluetooth is even changing their technology now. It's Bluetooth Low Energy, and they're doing some networking type infrastructures going on there. But then also with like, then it gets into the WAN, which is the wide area network. And you have your cellular technologies, your SATCOMs, your GPSs, but this is all the data and the communication that we're trying to really drive into a small device like a AirPod, right? If it's just super small, you're gonna do more of a PAN type environment. Or if it gets into a little bigger type device, you might have some Wi-Fi and a little bit of bigger battery, but again, everything is shrinking down. And now the expectation is to be able to drive these huge bandwidths of data out to the cloud, right? And then do all this data mining. But sometimes you don't have enough power or space to be able to drive it out to the cloud. So I'll talk a little bit about that too as we come up with a lot of the technologies is being processed within the devices now versus trying to send it off and then doing the processing externally. So that's a big key aspect as well.
Yeah, so it seems like power supply is probably like so I'm a chemist by training, so like your rate determining step, right? It seems like power is probably what eventually you just can't get any more of at a certain level, right? I mean, I'm sure it's been miniaturized and there'll always be technological advances there, but can you educate me a little bit on like, is that pretty much like we can only really generate so much power if you want it to be smaller than this?
Yeah, there are limitations, right? And so that's why you have to be as efficient with the power that you have as possible. And
Hmm.
so any overhead that you're sending data with, if it takes 1,000 bits to send 1 bit of data, right? I mean, you want to be cognizant of that.
Hmm.
And the power, I mean, as you probably know better than anybody, Dwayne. I mean, as far as the older technologies, the nickel metal hydrides, those used to be the super awesome technology. NiCad even before that. Right now, I'm really dating myself. Uh, but there's like the lithium ion, right? I mean, everything's lithium now. Lithium ion, lithium iron, lithium. I just heard about silicon. You could probably educate me a little bit more on that one. But they're really combining and creating as much energy in a small package as possible. But then you have like technologies like zinc air, which uses the air as part of its chemistry, right? So it's really cool because I mean, even in like the hearing aid, and this guy is super tiny, right?
Hmm.
But you have these tiny little batteries that are zinc airs. And so
Hmm.
you basically pull the strap out of one. It's either the anode or cathode, but you pull the plug, and then now it starts to be able to conduct and do its chemistry to provide that voltage. But to your point, it's it's with medical devices, it's always about safety and efficacy as well too. So what you don't want to do is have these tiny little batteries that if you just happen to puncture or whatever, it creates this huge energy outburst, right? And so there's
Right.
a ton of safety that the suppliers are going into, obviously. With with being able to fly with these types of batteries and being at a certain voltage, but we need to be able to design that in as things get smaller and more power for the punch. We have to still be safe and effective as a medical device
Yeah.
developer manufacturer.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I 60601, I think, is the power supply portion of FDA testing and other regulatory bodies, and so my first exposure to that was just like, oh, things that had to be plugged in, right? But then my whole like this whole like world of now the power supply of like a phone or anything like that has to be evaluated, and I didn't realize until I hosted a podcast on this topic of how important the fire safety aspect of that was, right? So it's really interesting. We have a couple questions coming in, so I'll look at those, but I do want to, I think one of them might be answered here by the cybersecurity piece of this, and more
Uh-huh.
specifically data mining, right? So when we were going through and talking about, hey, what are things we wanted to cover, it's this person asked this question just a second ago, and it's like they knew this was the next thing we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I
So
didn't plan that or anything.
right, yeah, it's a good lead in. So tell me about, right. So we're sending all this data out there. Um, Cybersecurity is a big issue.
Yeah, without a doubt.
We've talked about cybersecurity on in one of the Galen data webinar series. We had cybersecurity. We talked about it on the podcast before, and we've talked about it at our startup symposium in Houston. I mean, this is a really big concern right now. So kind of talk us through that.
Yeah, so I see it as a kind of an onion approach. So you have your HIPAA and your HIPAA compliant type information, and obviously you need to be secure in that aspect. But when somebody's hacking a Medtronic pacemaker, right? It takes that security not only for the patient but for the operation and for the safety and the efficacy of the product to an entire new level. And so you always kind of want to design for the worst case scenario, right? Of okay, how is it somebody or something is going to really degrade the data? And like I said, it's more of an onion approach. So anything is better than nothing, and the FDA is a little it's a little bit of a moving target, to be honest, right? As far as what the regulations are, what do you need to be secure? Data ports are obvious, but what is the expectation of a user? Are they going to crack the device open and go hack into the firmware? And the answer is yes, right? And so you need to be very aware of this and when you're going through your development. And so some of the onions or layers of the onion is obviously you want to have secure communication with some encryption, the data protection. You want the device integrity needs to be essential here because I mean, and especially as the app comes into play, now there's more ways to really mess the systems up, right? Or go in and get data that somebody wasn't really supposed to be getting into. So you have your some of your standard user authentication, maintenance is a key piece, and the FDA and frankly ISO and CE looks for this as well. The physical access I talked a little bit about. I mean, obviously, as things get smaller and smaller, it's tougher to get in. But usually, then there's like to your point with power, a lot of the devices are USB-C now. So one of the benefits is you can just pump a ton of power to charge batteries, but you need to have that encryption and be able to really incorporate that in that onion type level. The reliability, the availability of the like the firmware, and then the documentation is a key piece as well. So again, it's not necessarily that you have to implement every single one of those aspects, but implementing one is good, implementing two is better, implementing three. I mean, that's where you want to look at the safety classification of your medical device as well. And so
Yeah.
it's the classic MBA answer. It depends, but
Yeah.
the FDA does drive quite a bit of that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. The FDA, I mean, this is new for everybody, right? So the FDA is learning. And I think I've seen a lot of news on creating task force and things like that to really try to understand it better internally as this develops so rapidly amongst the industry. Two of the questions we had, and I think we may have answered them, but is there any type of medical certification or requirement standards on battery safety?
Oh yeah, so there's definitely so it's in the IEC standards and the ISO standards. Really, there's any technology, the battery technologies, laser technologies, pumps or whatever, right? Depending on the market, depending on the technology, is going to have its standards. And so and that's one of the things that people battle with, right? Is okay, am I building following ISO 13485 and doing the quality management system? Or am I doing what is it, the 21 CFR 820, right?
Oh yeah.
And doing the US, and it used to be that you would want to go to Europe and say, okay, I can get through and release my medical product in Europe, kind of test the market, test the product itself, and it's cheaper, it's faster that way. But that's really not the case anymore. They're really trying to make them equivalent. But then to the original question, yes, then you have to really drive the ISO requirements and the IEC requirements for the batteries. Now, a lot of times with the off-the-shelf batteries, the suppliers themselves will do a lot of that testing, the puncture testing, the heat testing, all that good stuff, the life cycles, excuse me, and all that. So that's where you really want to have a good supplier in that regard as well.
Okay, great. And the other question was, how do you protect and get consent from patients for data mining?
So that's on the OEM side.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So the HIPAA, so I mean, frankly, you just can't go and data mine patient data.
Right.
It's just not something that you can do. Now, the OEMs, and this gets into an actual OEM type question. There's consent and there's security and there's all these different layers. Again, it's these layers with this patient type interaction. Um, but that's a whole different layer as far as
Yeah.
uh, having that consent to access that HIPAA type. And I'm assuming it's HIPAA type information that they're talking about.
I'm not sure, and actually, that was kind of my going to be my point, right? Is from a HIPAA perspective, it's not in my wheelhouse. However, we are currently working with a startup company that is really early. We're talking like pre-seed stage, and
Mhm.
so I think for that, you'd be surprised at the amount of people who would be willing to give you scrubbed information in order to help build your machine learning or AI or code or whatever you're doing. We actually found multiple hospitals that are willing to do that and really just kind of partner with us rather than charge us for it. So I think it depends on what space, but Galen would probably be a good person to answer that question.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Um, awesome. So where did we leave off there? I think we just finished talking about the cybersecurity piece. Is there anything though on that connected medical devices? What's changed and where do you see it going that you want to add to it? Or did we cover everything you wanted to cover there?
Yeah, no, I think just one other story, and this is a lesson learned story, right?
Yeah.
With the connectivity and really the process in place, um, and the- with one of the companies that I was with, we had a urine monitor that we released to the market, and the thing was just, and I won't name names, but the thing was just we did all the documentation well, we tested it well, we did the design history file, we really did all the verification, um, and then went to validation. And this is one of those lessons learned, right? As we're driving, getting this user interface and this human factors aspect of it, what ended up happening is the device itself had one job, right? And we overcomplicate it, but the device needed to measure urine accurately. That was its one job in life. And so when we went out to the validation, what we found is as the patient rolled over, you get this influx of that we didn't know about of all this of all this fluid that really just saturated our product. And so the lesson learned there is, I mean, just always, we're talking about where to go with these products. Always are doing validation. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be a specific check mark. And okay, yeah, the FDA or CE requires this, and that's a true story. But really getting that human factor information up front and really doing as much of that pre-testing as possible as we're shrinking devices, as we're really pushing more power into devices. It's one of those lessons learned where if we could have gotten that information or as early in the process as possible, that would have saved a ton of headache down the road, even with the perfectly processed, perfectly driven system. You're just always wanting to get that validation input. And you don't even have to call it validation, but that's really basically what you're doing is getting that user-centric input for your devices. So
Yeah.
that was a valuable lesson learned for sure.
David, I think that's fantastic. Human factors, and this gets like into more of like a philosophical discussion that we should have offline when people aren't actually listening to us and we can ramble. But part of that is like when human factors became, and I think it was like 2016ish, became something that the FDA was all of a sudden going to start like kind of regulating to a certain
Yeah,
extent. It gets to be a dangerous thing because then people will come to you and say, oh, okay, well, the FDA only requires this amount of human factors, when in reality, human factors is like an engineering design type of thing that should be done throughout your entire product. And so what I always worry about with people who are new to the industry is that they look at the things the FDA regulates and thinks, well, that's all I have to do. And it's like, well, in some cases, yeah, that's okay to look at it that way. In others, it's not, right? You need to be building the most effective and safe product possible. And whatever gets you to that point, right? That's what you need to be doing. The FDA is there to make sure you're not shortcutting anything, right? And so, but the human factors thing is a really big deal that I've been having conversations with a lot of startups recently, that aren't looking at it in the way I'd probably like them to be looking at it.
Right. Well, those,
Um,
and exactly to your point, those are the barriers of entry for an FDA product, right?
mhm.
So, or a medical product, I should say. So I think it's, what is it? IEC 62366 is the usability requirement, but
Mhm.
that's just, it's like, okay, this is the minimum that a patient, but to your point, I mean, to take this into account again, right? I mean, this would have passed all the requirements and regulations, and you
Yeah.
test it, but it just wouldn't have been the device that that the patient or the
Right.
people need.
Yep. Yeah, I love it. And so with the human factors, regulatory FDA will tie that right into where we want to take the conversation next, which is how does regulatory requirements play into your development strategy?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about that already, but it's really a barrier of entry, right? So we talked about, it used to be cheaper, faster to go to Europe, but now everybody's either getting smarter or there's more regulations, depending on which side of the the fence you want to take a look at that. Um, but and again, the medical is typically a lagger. Um, there's a lot of testing that's involved too. So obviously, as we're developing and implementing these communication systems, a lot of times you can like buy a module from whoever, from Laird or from these different module manufacturers, and they'll come FCC pre-qualified and all that good stuff. But the problem is, as we're shrinking it, now you got to take the antenna out, you got to redesign the antenna, you got to really redesign where the electronics are going, and now you got to re-qualify it with the FCC. You got to go through to your point 60601, and so that's a lot of the product safety testing, and that still has to happen. But those barriers of entry and really understanding the testing requirements. So if you're looking at FCC or UL or TUV, depending on which market you're going after, it's really plays a key part, because everybody just wants to say, oh yeah, we're gonna flood the world and be hugely successful. Well, that requires following every single region's quality requirements, which then people don't want to take the time or the money to really drive each one. But it does a lot of times make sense to drive one specific one and then expand from there, depending on the maturity of the product and the company itself, of course, if it's a large company versus a startup.
Yeah, perfect. Um, what about combination products? And this is kind of a little more specific, but it's a really interesting one, because I had worked on a product like this in a few lives ago,
Okay.
with a different company, and the FDA was, and rightfully so, very concerned with products that deliver a drug but are delivering a drug based on something that it's sensing. So you could take like an insulin. Insulin's a great example, right? Okay, it reads your blood level, and then it automatically delivers insulin into the person as well, right? And the reason they're concerned with that is that there's a closed loop system. There's no human intervention there, right?
Right, right.
So if something goes wrong, it's a pretty big concern. But they also had a lot of other concerns related to, well, okay, now if something goes wrong with the hardware, and I could be misusing terms because I'm not an expert in this, but like, or if something goes wrong with the battery or any of the connectivity, right? Now the risk is there's too much of a drug going in, right? So can you talk a little bit through that? I might have butchered some of that there, but that's where my
Yeah,
head was.
no, so there's definitely and it gets more complex, obviously. I mean, it's a Q-tip is a medical device, but also a pharmaceutical delivery system is a medical device as well. But each one has different, you have the medical barriers of entry there, but the risk management is much different, and you have to address each of those. I think it's what ISO 14971, I think, is the risk management portion of it.
It
Um,
is.
And so what you want to do is, yeah, and we're learning with the combination devices. We're currently working on one as we speak, and the it really is driving the requirements. And so what are the requirements? What is the risk? What is the risk analysis? Not just from the and what are the fail safes, right? And so there can be uh, depending on the software. So then you'll have different classes of software that because of the mitigation and because of the criticality of the risk, it usually falls into it's the occurrence level and the criticality of it. And so if you identify a risk as high occurrence and high like fatality, obviously you better have multiple mitigations to be able to address that if the battery goes out or if the wrong medication is delivered, that kind of thing. And so a lot of the redundancy comes into play at that point, and a lot of the risk and the design will drive, and that's where you want to have that information up front, because last thing you want to do is develop a product and then the 11th hour, oh yeah, well we need to make the battery redundant, or the sensing system redundant, or do a fail safe, a check and balance with the patient and the actual user. So it definitely complicates the whole process, but it really it's fairly standardized though. It's the same development process. You still go through the risk analysis, but there's just a more more elements that you need to address, and that's what we're looking at with the combination device products. The SteraPak's a good resource on the pharmaceutical side as well. So, and that's one of the benefits of now being part of SteraPak, is we have access to Morristown with the human factors. We have access to the design for manufacturability, design for assembly, and we'll get a little bit of that from SteraPak. And then of course, being able to tie that into the connectivity, the battery, and all that good stuff too.
Awesome. And just as a reminder for everyone listening in, if you have direct questions, feel free to drop them in there. We had a few come up earlier, but we have a few more topics we want to discuss, but just wanted to just for those who missed that at the beginning, restate that. So the next question, and I'm going to ask for some heavy explanation and definitions here, because now we're heavy in the engineering area. So how does design for excellence, or DFX play a role in the design process for connected medical devices?
Yeah, so there's so DFX is really a term to encompass. You might have heard DFC, design for cost. You might have heard terms design for manufacturability, DFM, design for assembly, DFA, and really driving that into a smaller package. There's as we get smaller and smaller, we talk about the electronics more in the terms of microelectronics. And so what does that mean, right? And so one of the keys here is as you make things smaller and smaller, you every line, and as things get faster and faster, right, every line now turns into a transmission line. And so instead of just a point-to-point type access and analysis, and in just, for instance, using Ohm's law, right, voltage resistance times current, now you got to take into account intrinsic capacitance, intrinsic inductance, and it goes from Ohm's law to Maxwell's equations, which for those on the phone that know them are super excited, because those are really cool equations that really explain most electronics, including Ohm's law. You can really boil it down, but it gets into magnetic fields, electric fields, and you have to take all of this into account as things get smaller and frequencies go higher and higher, as we're pushing data rates in the gigahertz, and then even up into the optics type region as well. But then kind of going back to your original question, one of the things that's really popped up, especially post-COVID, is now I call it DFS, design for supply chain. And we are having projects where it's really the tail wagging the dog, where people are trying to find components, and literally, and I'm not kidding, there's people, it's kind of the Y2K. I mean, we talked about age. This is giving my age again. But if you recall, the Y2K was this big thing because, oh, it's going to go back to zero because there's not enough digits in any of the computer systems and the whole world's going to blow up, right? It happened again. I mean, so what happened is lead times went so high that they went beyond the 2 digits that people have for their systems. So it was 99 weeks. And so they didn't have anything higher than 99 weeks because they didn't have another digit in their system. So everything was 99-week lead times. So what happens is people find components, pull them in, and then design around that component. And again, I think the pendulum's going to hopefully change here as we go forward. But it also drove obviously costs for components too. So we would have somebody manufacturing a product, and they would need $1 microchip, for example, and can't find them on the planet except for one supplier who just happens to have them, and they're selling them for literally $100. I kid you not. This is what we're seeing and have seen in the marketplace. And so so there's a lot of design for supply chain that's happening now. But then again, as I mentioned earlier, having that microelectronics and really having that as a path forward, because it does decrease the lengths of the wire. So now they're not acting as antennas either, right? So now you're radiating all this energy because it's at such high frequency. You need to mitigate that. You need to design around that, and that's part of the design for excellence and really creating higher performance devices as they get smaller and smaller. There's some natural benefits too because it's thinner, they're lighter. Typically they are lower power requirements, right? So it used to be that 5-volt buses were the norm, then 3.3, and then 1 volt. I mean, it's getting so low, which is a good thing. And so that's driving the technology and the power so that we can create these smaller and smaller devices. But it's just another technology, another aspect of the design process that needs to be implemented.
Yeah, so this whole section, like for me specifically, I find it super valuable. So Project MedTech, we have essentially someone who does a lot of the supply chain logistics and manufacturing stuff for our companies and kind of owns it internally. We're not a contract manufacturer or anything like that, but he always talks about these terms, and I'm just like, yeah, Aaron, this is great, but I'm kind of over a little bit. But then, it's when a third party explains it to me, I'm like super interested in it. So I'm sure he'll be thrilled to hear that.
Well, hopefully I didn't put everybody on the phone to sleep, but or on the webinar.
No, I mean it's so important right now, and this isn't, I guess, necessarily exactly on like the miniaturization of everything, but this is such an important piece to now consider where it's like, well, how do we get our margins down as low as possible, but also how do we have some reliability that we know we can get what we need to get when we need to get it? Because you have your sales teams out there selling this into a hospital or selling this into the healthcare system as a whole. And the worst thing that can happen is that you finally get someone to say, great, yep, we want to purchase your product. Oh, well, it's going to be a 4-month delay on the product. And that's not a great start for you, right? So this is a really important piece of the puzzle that you brought up. And the design for supply chain piece is really, really interesting. At least to me, that's having to become a reality right now.
Well, it is, and that's just the state of where we're at. And like I said, you don't want to, you want to see where the puck's going, right? You want to skate to where the puck's going to be at. And so really understanding that up front in the process, it's the whole ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's so imperative that we address this early and often in the process and the design. And again, it does tie into the miniaturization, because then you have these micro E devices that do increase the reliability because there are less interconnects, for instance. The wireless technology helps in that aspect as well. And so it really, and even just the surface mount technology, I mean, that's getting smaller and smaller with the fine pitch components. I mean, it used to be the 1206s were the small component. Now they're 0.01, 0.05 components. You can barely even see them, much less test them. But you
Yeah.
have to have means to be able to go in and test, do some in-circuit testing, do some functional testing, and this is do some troubleshooting through the process if it's through the alpha or the beta stage. These are the things that as we shrink the devices that we really need to be cognizant of.
Yeah. So is there anything else on what we've talked about so far that you want to touch on before we get into some real life examples that I can see sitting on your desk back there?
Yeah. No, I have some good examples back there. I think I mean, as we're looking at integrating, so everything's sensing something, right? It's blood pressure, glucose, or ECG, EEG, EMG, and like I said about the fluid monitor, a lot of times your device has one job, right? And you need to do that job really well and really better than everybody else. And then the other 12 things that it does, yeah, those are good. And as long as it does that one job well, then really that's where that's what drives that specific technology. And as we're getting more and more in the wearables, we're seeing body mounted, obviously, and I'll talk a little bit about that as far as the watches. Rings, we're looking at even getting into smart jewelry with rings and bracelets and that kind of thing, glasses. There was the big augmented reality that Google did a number of years back, but that's inevitably, I know it didn't go so well back then, but it's coming back, I guarantee you. And so integrating those kind of technologies, but what does that do? That does a lot of the processing within the device, within the embedded system. And so we're getting into the AI, the machine learning, some of the FPGA, the super high-speed FPGA devices, and really integrating those to approach and be able to tackle the needs, I guess is my point, of these new wearable devices, if it's into the smart clothing or the augmented technology, that's what's on the table with the vision systems and stuff. That's where we're going for sure.
So David, you brought up a great point about some technology had been tried previously, and you said it's going to come back, right? And this is something we talk about again with med tech companies all the time, is that your time to market's really important. Trying to shorten that, get to market faster, all these different things. But there is something that no matter what, med tech companies just really can't control, and that's the opening and closing of your opportunity window, right? When the market says yes, we're ready for this, or no, we're not. However, with that being said, like you had mentioned, sometimes that window might have been closed 10 years ago and you thought it was open, right? And it could have been open for a small amount of time, and then it reopens later on. You got to be ready to pounce on it. So you brought up a good point, because I think we see that a lot with different technologies, and especially in a historically conservative space like healthcare, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I kind of preface this with a lot of really early entrepreneurs of, you are getting into a very conservative industry that takes time to change and get up to speed on things. So you just have to have that patience. But with that being said, I'd love to hear. We've got 10 minutes left, and so if questions come in, we'll pop those questions in. But I'd like to see some of we've seen some of the technology back there, but you brought some real life examples of miniaturization in healthcare.
Yeah. So definitely. So an example of this, and so this is a seizure detection device. It straps onto the arm, or it has an electrode, I should say, that goes onto the arm, measures the EMG signal, and then takes that EMG signal and transmits it to the caregiver, then transmits that to the clinician. And so it's we talked a little bit about, okay, you want to trigger, or you want to be able to react to events. And so there's a lot of that going on with seizures or with heart attacks or whatever, right? Because the sooner you can act on it, the better. It's then going to go into preventative. So what is the precursors for events and stuff like that? And that's where a lot of there's obviously regulatory issues with, if you're analyzing versus a doctor analyzing, you get into some trouble there. But the preventative type technologies are going to be big because now we can shrink this type of device. It was Wi-Fi. You can see the electrodes for the or the connections for the electrodes, I should say, are fairly large. We're shrinking that now down to a device size that now has Bluetooth, and so this gets into, okay, we don't want the little flip phone. Now we want to be able to. We don't necessarily need to connect to this to the cell tower, but now we can connect to this to the phone that the caregiver has. And so now we're putting Bluetooth into this device. We're separating the chip, so it's not just a module. So now we got to go through the FCC testing. We need to go through all the regulatory testing on that regard. And so that's an example of really taking, and a lot of times what we'll do is we'll come out with a product for a company or a customer, and we'll have it in a certain size, right, or a certain form factor, and then really drive the next generation of shrinking or being able to make that more either reach more markets or reach more patients or that kind of thing. But again, it really gets into, you have one job, right? And you better do that job really well with your device. So that's an example of a seizure detection device. Monitoring, we talked about jewelry, right? So this is a little watch that monitors the heart rate, temperature, that kind of thing. This is a little older technology, but there's a ton of watch applications, especially with the Fitbits or the iWatch or whatever, right? They're coming out. That's faster than you can sneeze at here.
Right.
The technologies, I mean, and it's getting into, I mean, this is a little SpO2 monitor, and even iPhone is getting into some medical. They're looking at, okay, what is the watch? Is it a medical device? Is it not a medical device? And they're having those conversations with the FDA and with CE as well. But really integrating, and it gets into and you hit it on the head, Dwayne, the human factors aspect of it. And so even though you shrink it, like Zoolander was doing, can you access it, right? And can you, what is the access points for it? Because my kids now, they don't know what a non-touch screen is anymore. They see one, and every screen they're trying to touch it, or even buttons for keyboards, right? That technology. I mean, everybody's, oh no, iPhone, they'll never make it because they don't have dedicated buttons. But yeah, the BlackBerry kind of made a hit and miss on that one, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
but yeah, it gets into that human factors, that UI aspect of it,
Yeah.
and again, really being able to drive that now internally within SteraPak with Morristown and Frederick development. I'm excited. So we definitely have a really good path forward for our customers.
Yeah, the fitness watch one is really interesting for the med tech space because like on a software as a medical device side, you have clinical decision support products or software as a medical device, and the FDA has just recently come out with some guidance. Actually, a boss from Galen and Alex and Chris and the whole team shared that information on their LinkedIn probably a couple weeks ago that I saw it, but it was a pretty good update there, right? And so there's that blurry line of what's clinical decision support, what's an actual medical device, and the FDA is kind of working through that. But the one that's applicable to this is the wearables discussion, because like you look at, okay, this is like my Whoop information, right? It
Right.
tells me respiratory rate, my blood oxygen levels, resting heart rate, my heart rate variability, right? And then you wonder for some of these other wearables, like at what point does this watch go, well, we could detect falls, we could detect seizures, we could do
Exactly.
this, we could do that. And then, it gets into a really, really interesting gray area of what is not a device and what is a device. And it feels like this space is going to follow the close footsteps of software as a medical device, just based on kind of what you showed me and trends in the industry.
Well, and not just, and software is a broad term, right? And so not just software as an app, but software in the firmware as well, right? and even driving the software that's driving a piece of hardware. I mean, there's discussions going on now where a year ago it was acceptable to have this trigger that's hardware driven, but what's driving the trigger, right? It's a little piece of software that's within the device. It's like, well, is that software now? Is it not software? I mean, it's a little bit of a moving target, and people frankly are pissed because there's systems that worked a couple years ago through regulatory, or the regulatory agencies are saying, oh no, you have to mitigate this now differently. But that happens, right? That's where we just need to understand, to your point, what the landscape is, understanding what the changes to the landscape are, and just get as far in front of it as possible.
Yeah, awesome. So, David, with that being said, thank you so much for doing this. Thanks everyone for attending and listening in. I can say, David, that I've been hosting these since like maybe the middle of 2021 is when I started doing this with Galen. And I can tell you that no one has done show and tell yet. So props to you for actually bringing some products to show. For those who are still listening, we will have a December Galen webinar, and we're cooking up a pretty good one for that as well that we'll be announcing here shortly. There's information on the screen about Galen and how to reach out to Galen should you have questions on this webinar or just in general for Galen. And then don't forget there's 3 handouts that you could download and take with you as well. One on HWI and one on Galen, and then a white paper on connected devices. So with that being said, thanks everyone for joining in, and David, thank you so much for taking the time to walk through some of this with us.